Imagine if every word you spoke today was drawn from a number you could not see, not a metaphor, an actual countdown, ticking down every time your mouth opened, and once it hit 0, your words simply stopped working the way they used to. Nobody warned you it existed. Nobody tells you how close you are to the bottom. But suppose such a system existed inside every human being. The real question is not whether it sounds strange. The real question is how close it already looks to something you have lived through without ever naming it. Start with what you already know. Think about the last time you talked for hours without a break. A long shift explaining the same instructions again and again. A day of back-to-back meetings. Somewhere in the middle, something shifted. Your sentences got shorter. Your patience thinned. You reached for yeah instead of a full thought. Now suppose that shift was not just tiredness. Suppose it was a real, measurable resource running low. The same way a phone battery drops with every notification. Let's assume this hypothetical budget is not about lung capacity or vocabulary. Assume it is tied to something closer to attention and self-control, the same reserve psychologist Roy Baumeister studied when he introduced the idea of ego depletion, the theory that self-control draws from one shared, limited tank. In his experiments, people who resisted temptation in one task performed worse on an unrelated task of willpower minutes later. Careful talking is an act of constant self-control. You choose which words to say and which to hold back hundreds of times a minute without ever noticing the choosing. If a word budget existed, this is exactly the kind of hidden machinery it would run on. Now push the hypothetical further. Suppose researchers discovered that this budget was not identical for everyone, but that each person operated around a personal daily baseline, one that barely shifted on ordinary days. This lines up with something psychologist Matthias Mehl actually found using a wearable recorder that tracked natural speech. Word counts vary enormously between individuals, but within one person, the number tends to hold steady across similar days. In this hypothetical world, that steadiness would not be a coincidence. It would be evidence of a real ceiling, one that only moves under real strain, like stress, illness, or emotional overload. If such a system existed, the body would almost certainly be involved too. Speech researchers have measured genuine fatigue in the vocal folds during extended talking, the same kind of wear any muscle shows under sustained use. Teachers, call center workers, and voice actors show this pattern constantly. Now imagine that physical fatigue was not separate from the hypothetical mental budget, but tangled up with it, each one draining the other. A tired voice would make word choice harder. Difficult word choice would burn through the voice faster. The two systems would feed on each other, exactly the way two overlapping resources tend to in the real world. Suppose this budget also explained something people already describe but rarely question, the exhaustion of a full day of small talk. Ask anyone who has sat through hours of introductions and forced conversation at a conference. By evening, many want nothing but silence, not because they dislike anyone, but because something in them needs to stop producing language. People already call this a social battery. In this hypothetical, that phrase would not be a figure of speech. It would be a plain description of a running total finally reaching its limit. If the budget were real, the cost would not be flat. Some words would clearly cost more than others. A conversation with someone who finishes your sentences, who already understands your shorthand, would barely dent the total. A conversation where you have to explain, translate, or justify every thought to a stranger would cost far more, even at the same length. This tracks with cognitive load theory, developed by educational psychologist John Sweller, which describes how working memory has a limited capacity for processing new information in real time. Speaking is not just output. It is drafting, predicting, and editing a sentence in the fraction of a second before it leaves your mouth. In this hypothetical, every one of those micro-edits would pull directly from the same shrinking total. Now let the implications spread outward the way they would in any system under pressure. How would a household run differently if this budget were visible? A parent who spent the sharpest, most patient hours of the day on a demanding client might arrive home with almost nothing left to explain something gently to their own child. The client would get the good version, the child would get what was left over, and in this hypothetical, everyone in the family would eventually learn to read the difference. How would workplaces adapt? Meetings might get restructured entirely, front-loaded early in the day, before anyone's reserve dropped too low, with the most difficult conversations scheduled first instead of last. Some companies might start measuring word cost the way they measure hours, treating a tense negotiation as a bigger withdrawal than a routine check-in. Suppose customer service jobs, which demand hours of careful, patient language with strangers, became some of the most heavily compensated roles precisely because they burn through the budget fastest. How would schools change? Suppose a teacher's 6th class of the day reliably got a thinner, more compressed explanation than the first, not from laziness, but from a documented dip in available reserve. Schools might start scheduling the most complex subjects earlier in the morning when the hypothetical budget runs fullest, and save repetitive drills for the afternoon when a shorter, simpler explanation would do the same job for less cost. And suppose, as with any limited resource, a black market of sorts emerged around it. People already borrow patience for one difficult call by staying silent through an entire commute beforehand. In this hypothetical, that quiet commute would not be a coincidence. It would be strategic conservation, the same instinct that makes someone save their last bit of phone battery for an emergency call, instead of scrolling it away on nothing. Here's the part that makes the hypothetical worth sitting with. Even if no such literal countdown exists, notice how naturally every piece of this system maps onto real documented behavior. Measurable vocal fatigue, well-studied self-controlled depletion, consistent personal speech patterns, and a well-known drop in patience by the end of a long day. The premise is invented. The mechanics underneath it are not. So imagine for one day that the budget was visible to you the way a phone battery is visible, ticking down in the corner of your vision with every sentence you spoke. Would you have spent your sharpest, calmest words on a stranger's small talk, or saved them for the person waiting for you at home? The countdown was never really invisible. It just never asked to be looked at directly until now.